The Old Testament is really a very, very interesting document. It has information for us that really enlighten us about the things that take place in the New Testament. Now, knowledge of the Old Testament is very important for us then. There are many characters in the Old Testament that we can benefit from as we read of their lives. And I'd like to read from the New Testament book of 1 Corinthians and call attention to what Paul has to say about the use of the Old Testament. He says, "I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brethren, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate of the same spiritual food, and they drank of the very same spiritual rock. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert." Now these things occurred, and this is really the key to what I'm saying. These things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolatrous, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and they were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and they were killed by the destroyer. These things have happened to them as examples, where they were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. Well, that tells us something about the importance of the Old Testament. The examples that we have in the Old Testament are so very, very valuable to us. And so tonight I want us to just look at the examples of some great men in the Old Testament. I've chosen a few of those men, not at random, but because each of them has something quite unique to tell us about the kind of life that he lived. Let's begin with at least one of my favorites, and that's this fellow Elijah. Elijah, in the book of James, Elijah is spoken of as a man of like passions as we. He was just a real human being. When I read, for example, about Moses, I see so much that he did and so many good things that he did. And he was such a prominent man. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the same way. But now some of these other fellows we kind of pass over. Oh yes, we've heard about Elijah, but we don't really see some things about him. Do you ever get discouraged? Everybody say yes. We all get discouraged at one time or another, don't we? Well, we can find some kinship with this man Elijah, because of all of the people in the Old Testament, we have things about his discouragement. Jeremiah, that we'll talk about in just a few moments, Jeremiah was very much the same way. Folks, it isn't wrong to be discouraged. It isn't a sign of weakness to be discouraged. It's a sign of weakness when we allow the discouragement to overshadow us, allow the discouragement to direct our paths and make us into something that we really don't want to be. Well, Elijah fought the battles of discouragement. Let's just talk a little bit about this fellow. The thing that we're first introduced to, the things that first introduce us to this fellow Elijah, are just simply when he appeared before the king, who was Ahab, a very wicked king, by the way. But when he appeared before the king, he says, "King, guess what?" Well, he didn't say guess what, but that's the idea. He said, "King, there's not going to be any rain. There's not going to be any dew for a long time, except at my word." Well, the king didn't like that. And Elijah, ultimately Elijah had to go off and hide himself, and God fed him with the ravens. I remember when I was a little boy, we had a picture that was up on the wall in the Bible classroom for the children, and it was a picture of Elijah being fed by the ravens. God was caring for him. Well, Elijah went back and he ran into just a terrible situation, and Ahab and his wife Jezebel were partly responsible for the terrible situation that existed there in Israel at that time. You see, Jezebel was really from Sidon, so she was a Sidonian. That was the modern-day country of Lebanon, and she was a strong worshiper of the god Baal. And she brought this, when she became queen, when Ahab married her, and she came over into Samaria, she brought a lot of those practices with her. Well, there was already a lot of practice of the worship of Baal right there in Israel. But she just really emphasized this. Well, when Elijah came on the scene again, he said, "Is Baal God or is Jehovah God?" He said, "Let's put them to a test. Let's meet on Mount Carmel, and you Baalites, you bring your animal, and I will bring an animal, and we will have a sacrifice. But nobody brings any matches, okay? Nobody brings any fire. But we'll pray to our gods, and the God who answers with fire, he will be the God of Israel." Well, that sounded like it was a reasonable thing to them. And so 300 prophets of Baal gathered together, and some prophetesses of Baal. They came together and they began praying. They prepared the altar and all. They began praying, and nothing happened. And they prayed for a long time, and nothing happened. And then Elijah, I can just imagine this. Elijah said, "Yeah, maybe Baal's asleep and you need to wake him up. Shout a little louder." I've always thought that was such a funny thing. And they prayed for a while, and then Elijah said, "It may be that Baal is off on a trip somewhere, and that's the reason he's not answering you." Well, there was a custom that was followed by some of the pagan people. They thought that if they cut themselves with knives and they bled and they injured themselves or abused themselves, their suffering would bring the blessings of their God. And so they did. They cut themselves and all, and nothing happened. And finally they gave up. And then Elijah, it was about sundown by that time, Elijah repaired the ark, the altar of God that was there. And Elijah prepared the wood, and then he says, "Pour water on it." They poured water on it. "Do it again." They did it again. And they poured and poured and poured. They poured so much water on it that water went down in a little trench that he had dug around the altar. And then he prayed a very simple prayer. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice. It lapped up the water, the whole thing. It even consumed the altar. And all of the people were so amazed at this, they said, "Jehovah is God." And so they turned toward God, and the prophets of Baal were killed. Well, that just sounded like a great victory, doesn't it? It was a great victory. And Elijah, I can just see Elijah just feeling like, I have accomplished a great thing for God today. This has been something to bring Israel back to God. But he had another thought coming. Jezebel said, "I'm going to find Elijah and I'm going to kill him." And so Elijah had to flee. This great victory now turned into great discouragement, because the victory didn't last and the victory was not complete. And Elijah was very discouraged, and he ran away. He went to the south. God said, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah answered and he said, Lord, they've cut down your altars. They've killed your prophets. I'm the only one left. God fed Elijah. He assured Elijah that there were some thousands of people who had not bowed the knee to Baal. Elijah got up from there and he went on further south, and he heard that voice from God again. Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah gave the same answer. And this was a repeat of the same thing. You see, sometimes discouragement repeats itself, and it begins piling up on us. We get discouraged about our children. We get discouraged about our neighbors. We get discouraged about the church. We get discouraged about our job. We get discouraged about all kinds of things. And it seems sometimes that these things just won't go away. And one of the things about being discouraged a lot of times is that it's not what we did that was wrong. It's the consequences that other people bring on us because of what we did. Now, let's kind of hang that on a hook for just a minute. Let's turn over and see if Jesus wasn't just like that. Do you remember in the 16th chapter of Matthew, Jesus said, whom do men say that I am? And some of them said, well, John the Baptist or Elijah or Isaiah, one of the prophets. Isn't it interesting that Jesus Christ was like one of the prophets? Jesus Christ was like John the Baptist. And yet these people became very discouraged at various times, didn't they? John the Baptist, when he was in jail, he sent word by messengers, said, are you really the one looking for? Or are we to expect someone else? Discouragement has a way of grabbing hold of us. Now, when Elijah finally heard the last voice from God, what did God do? God said, Elijah, I still have work for you. No matter what your discouragement is, God still has some work for us. Now, Elijah could have said, no more for me. I've had it. I did the best I could with these people, and you see what happened? I've been serving you, Lord, and it hadn't worked. That's all there is to it. I am not successful. I'm a failure. The people turned back to you, and then they left. And I haven't accomplished what needs to be accomplished. He could have said that, and that would have been true. Jesus could have said that. Jesus could have said, God, I came to these people and I did my very best. I served them, I taught them, I did all of these things, and they're rejecting me. I'm just going to give up on it. It's not worth it. No, he didn't do that. Elijah didn't give up. God gave Elijah a job to go over to Syria and do some work there in Syria. A very, very important thing that he did. And the thing is that when discouragement takes us over and we refuse to listen to the voice of God, the Word, we refuse to listen to the Word and think of God's presence with us and God's help for us, the devil continues to use discouragement on us. And so Elijah was a very human being, a very human being, because he was like we are. And when discouragement came, he had a hard time handling it. But the encouraging thing is that when God gave him a job to do, he said, yes, I will do it. And that was the key to Elijah's ultimate success. He was willing to do what God said do, in spite of the fact that he was discouraged there. Well, there's another man who's a great example for us. He also is one of my favorite people in the Old Testament. Naturally, I chose my favorite people to talk about tonight. But this is a fellow by the name of Hezekiah. Maybe some of you really have never read about Hezekiah. Hezekiah was just such an interesting individual. He was the king of Judah. You remember the kingdom divided, and those to the north were called the kingdom of Israel, and those to the south were called the kingdom of Judah. Well, he was king of the kingdom of Judah, and just a few years after he became king in the south, the northern kingdom was carried into Assyrian captivity. They were carried over into the country of Assyria, and then they were dispersed into many, many different places. Well, Hezekiah was the king of the south when this happened. The Assyrians were some of the most brutal people in the history of the Middle East. They are the Iraqis, by the way, of our present day. And their capital, Nineveh, is right across, it's ruined. The ruins of the city of Nineveh are right across the river from the modern day city of Mosul. And it's kind of interesting to see the parallels here. Well, but maybe that helps us to see this in a little more real fashion. The Assyrians destroyed Samaria, and then they came and they were going to fight against Judah, but they taxed Judah at first, and then later they came and they were going to destroy Judah. Well, what they did, they came on down and they destroyed many of the cities down in the south part of Judah. But when they came to Jerusalem and they were going to destroy Jerusalem, a funny thing happened. The army had a plague of some kind, and many, many people in the army died overnight. An interesting thing about this is that the Greek historian Herodotus, he tells about this. He doesn't know why they died, but he said the Assyrians, when they came against Jerusalem, the Assyrians had to leave because there was a massive death in their camp. Well, that's exactly what the Bible tells us. Herodotus didn't attribute this to God, but the whole thing was that while the Assyrians were attacking the cities to the south, Hezekiah knew the threat, and so Hezekiah did something. Now, this is a lesson in preparation. He is an example of a person who prepares. You see, he was a very godly man, and he moved Judah back toward God more so than any other king that Judah had ever had. And so he was spoken of that way, but he realized that God provided. But folks, God provides for the people who prepare. And that's exactly what he did. Well, here was the situation. Jerusalem got its water from a well called the Waters of Gihon, which was just outside the city wall. Oh, that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing. Because when an ancient army would lay siege to a city, they would encompass the city, cut off their water supply, cut off their food supply, and starve them out. It may take 2 or 3 years, but that's the way they did it. And now, Hezekiah has a little bit of time. You know he's in trouble. He has a little bit of time, and so they built a tunnel that went under the wall and up to the pool of Siloam on the inside, on the inside of the city. And back in the 1800s, there was nobody ever knew where this tunnel was. But back in the 1800s, there was an archaeologist who had his little daughter with him. And they were there at the spring of Gihon, but no tunnel. They were there at the spring of Gihon, And the little girl almost slipped. She slipped and almost fell into the water that was there. And as he picked her up, he saw an inscription there. And he was an archaeologist and he knew how to read it. And it was an inscription that told about the building of the tunnel. And right close to them there was the entrance to the tunnel, which was all filled up now with debris and stone and everything. But they began raking all of that off. And surely enough, now you can walk all the way through that tunnel under the wall into the city. This is called the Siloam inscription. It's in a museum in Turkey now. They carved it out of the rock and carried it to a museum in Turkey. But the important thing about it is that, well, two important things, that archaeologists discovered this, and before that nobody knew anything about what this tunnel was like. It's a very fascinating story about how they built it, how they dug it, because it went through solid rock. Now, what about Hezekiah? I said he is a lesson in preparation. Folks, every one of us has a role that we can play in preparation for things of the congregation, for things in our families. It's a very important thing for us to look to the future and say to ourselves, what are our objectives now for the future? I remember when I was at Glendale, we had a family seminar, and we all got together on a Saturday. After part of this seminar was over, we all got together on a Saturday in multipurpose room. I've forgotten how many people we had. We had about 75 people, mostly family people. And I asked them, I said, I want you to close your eyes. That's bad for a preacher to say. I want you to close your eyes. Don't go to sleep. But imagine, what will my family be like 5 years from now? Will there be any deaths? Will there be any births? Will there be someone finding a job, someone losing a job? Will there be children who now have gone off to college? Will there be graduation? Will there be all of these things, you know? Imagine what my family will be like in 5 years. What am I doing now to make it better? What kind of objectives are in my mind? In 5 years, this is what I want my family to look like. In 5 years, this is what I want to look like. And so one of the ladies came to me and she said, I have never thought of that before. Well, Hezekiah is a great example for us of an individual who saw a danger, who saw an opportunity to save his nation. And so he prepared to do that. What am I doing to prepare for the next 5 years, say, or even the next year? Well, we're almost on the brink of 2015, aren't we? What are going to be my goals? My spiritual goals, my financial goals, my family goals. What are going to be my goals for 2015? Well, I want to talk about one other fellow here, and then we'll close. This man, we know his name so very well. I kind of hate to say this, but it's kind of doubtful if many of us have really ever looked closely at the man. It's Jeremiah. A lot of people have never read the book of Jeremiah. It's one of the longest books in the Old Testament, and the book of Jeremiah tells us about a wonderful man. Jeremiah has been referred to as a weeping prophet, and if you remember, the book of Lamentation comes right after Jeremiah. It's a book of laments. He is so disturbed over the fact that now Jerusalem is destroyed. But let's look at this man as time leads up to that. Jeremiah was a very bold man. I would think, as I read the book of Jeremiah, I would think that the people of his day said that he was very abrasive, that he was very he presented the message of God in a very, very strong way. He was very condemnatory. He was all of those things. But why was he that way? He was that way because he was trying to appeal to the people who, in just a matter of a few years, were going to be carried into captivity into the country of Babylon. He couldn't stand to see, he just couldn't stand to see his nation fall apart. I was talking to Joe Alessandro just before services began. I can remember so very, very well when I first moved to California in 1967. We had a very strong church over at York Boulevard. We had a strong church at Glendale. We had a strong church here at Burbank. We had a strong church in Sun Valley. Another strong church over in San Fernando. Another very strong church over in Van Nuys. There may have been others. I don't know. You know, the sad part about it is that out of those strong churches, only Glendale and Burbank have survived. And both of them are much, much, much smaller than they used to be. You see, that's kind of the situation that Jeremiah found himself in. He says, my nation is crumbling. Why are they crumbling? They're crumbling because they have not taken God seriously. They're crumbling because they see the false prophets. And the false prophets have such nice things to say. The false prophets are so attractive in their presentations. The false prophets are so optimistic for the future and all of this. And Jeremiah says, yes, but they're false prophets. He says, here's what God really says. Amen. And he told the people, God is not pleased. And if you don't mend your ways, you're going to be destroyed. The Babylonians are going to come in and they're going to carry you as captives. And so Jeremiah is our example here of a man who was so disturbed about the moral, the ethical, the religious condition of his people that he wept over it. He didn't just get angry over it, he wept over it. And he did all that he could to bring these people to a realization of the fact that, hey folks, if you don't straighten that up, you're going to be punished. Oh, I don't like to hear that. You know, I don't like to preach that. But Jeremiah said, whether I like it or not, whether they like it or not, I've got to bring you the truth. I've got to get you to see that the road that you're traveling on has an end to it, and you're not going to like that end. And so these men are great examples for us, I think. Elijah, Hezekiah, and Jeremiah. They tell us something about what life was like, what life is like, and what life can be like. And each of them had something that was very unique in their personality and their work and how they presented themselves. Something that was very unique that had a message attached to it. And that message said, follow the Lord. Follow God. We're going to sing an invitation song. If you are in any way subject to the invitation of Christ, we invite you to come. Stand together while we sing.